The cold void of space stretched endless and dark at the edge of known space. Here, where the last stars faded into nothing, the Zelhari Empire had built their most distant monitoring stations. For 3,000 years, these stations had watched the empty darkness, recording nothing but cosmic dust and dying light. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, studying the readings that had brought him here. His 4 eyes, arranged in a diamond pattern on his elongated skull, focused on the data streams flowing across the holographic displays. The Zelhari had ruled the galaxy for so long that most species had forgotten there was ever a time before their empire. "Admiral," called out his sensor officer, her voice carrying the musical tones typical of their species. "The energy signatures are getting stronger. Whatever is out there, it's big." "Multiple contacts." Kethavar's scaled hands gripped the railing of his command platform. In all his centuries of service, he had never seen readings like these. The energy patterns were ancient, almost prehistoric by galactic standards, yet they pulsed with a strange vitality that made his skin crawl. "Distance to contacts?" he asked. 40,000 kilometers and closing, sir. They appear to be ships, derelict vessels of unknown design." The main view screen flickered to life, showing the approaching objects. Even at this distance, Kethvar could see they were massive. Dark hulls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange angles and curves that hurt to look at directly. These were not ships built by any species the Empire had encountered. "Analysis?" Kethvar demanded. His science officer, a young Zelhari named Veltan, worked frantically at his station. "Sir, the hull composition is unlike anything in our databases. The metal appears to be a composite we've never seen before, and the age—" He paused, double-checking his readings. "Sir, these ships are old, very old. Initial scans suggest they've been drifting for at least 10,000 years. 10,000 years. Kethvar felt a chill run down his spine. That took them back to the time of the Great Purge, when the Empire had systematically eliminated the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Species too violent, too unpredictable, too threatening to the perfect order the Zelhari had established. "Sir," Veltan continued, his voice now trembling slightly, "I'm detecting markings on the hull, symbols. The computer is trying to translate them now." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of the ship's systems. Every officer waited as the Empire's vast databases searched through millions of dead languages and extinct civilizations. The computer worked for long minutes, cross-referencing symbols and patterns, digging deeper into files that hadn't been accessed for millennia. Finally, the translation appeared on the screen. Kethvar read it once, then again, unable to believe what he was seeing. "Human," he whispered. The word sent a shockwave through the bridge crew. Every Zelhari knew that name, though most believed it to be mythology. Humans were the species that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization before the Empire had been forced to act. They were the reason the Great Purge had been necessary. "Sir?" the communications officer called out, her voice tight with fear. "The human ships. They're responding to our scans. Power levels are increasing across all vessels." On the view screen, the dark hulls began to glow with an eerie blue light. Lines of energy traced across their surfaces like veins of liquid fire. The ships that had drifted dead for 10,000 years were coming to life. "Impossible," Kethvar breathed. "The humans were extinct. We made sure of that." But even as he spoke, he remembered the old stories. Humans had been different from other species. Where most races accepted defeat and died with dignity, humans had run. They had fled to the darkest corners of space, fighting and hiding even when their cause was hopeless. The Empire had hunted them for decades, finding and destroying colony after colony. But some ships had escaped into the void between galaxies, beyond the reach of even the Empire's vast fleets. "Admiral," Veltan reported, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm reading life signs aboard the human vessels. Faint but present. Sir, there are people alive on those ships." The implications hit Kethvar like a physical blow. If humans had survived, if they had been hiding in the darkness all this time, then everything the Empire believed about the Great Purge was wrong. They hadn't eliminated the human threat. They had only delayed it. "How many ships?" he asked. 12 confirmed contacts, sir. Possibly more beyond our sensor range. 12 ships. Against his fleet of 60 vessels, it should have been nothing. But these were human ships, and humans had never followed the normal rules of warfare. They had been unpredictable, creative, and utterly ruthless when cornered. "Sir," the communications officer called out again, "one of the human ships is hailing us." Kethvar straightened in his command chair. After 10,000 years of silence, the humans wanted to talk. He wondered if they remembered what the Empire had done to their people, if they understood how completely they had been defeated. "Open the channel," he ordered. The view screen flickered, and for a moment Kethvar saw something that made his blood freeze. The interior of a human ship, dimly lit and filled with strange technology. And standing in the center of it, very much alive, was a human being. She was smaller than he had expected, as humans always were. Her skin was pale, almost white, and her hair was the color of old starlight. But her eyes held the weight of 10,000 years of waiting. "I am Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Fleet," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the void. "You are trespassing in human space." Kethvar almost laughed. "Human space? These 12 ancient ships claimed territory in the empty void? I am Admiral Kethvar of the Zelhari Empire," he replied, putting all his authority into his voice. "The Zelhari Empire controls this region of space. You will surrender your vessels for inspection and prepare to be escorted to the nearest Imperial facility." The human woman's expression didn't change. She simply stared at him with those terrible patient eyes. "Admiral," she said quietly, "do you know what happened to Earth?" The question caught him off guard. Of course he knew. Every Imperial officer knew the history of the Great Purge. "Earth was cleansed," he said formally. "The human species was eliminated as a threat to galactic peace." Captain Chen nodded slowly. 20 billion people, she said. "Men, women, children. All dead because you decided we were too dangerous to live." "Your species was unstable," Kethvar replied, though something in her tone made him uncomfortable. "The Empire had no choice." "No choice," she repeated. Then for the first time she smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Admiral, do you know how long 10,000 years is?" Before he could answer, she continued. "It's long enough to remember, long enough to plan, long enough to become something more than what we were." The lights on the human ships pulsed brighter, and Kethvar's sensor officer cried out in alarm. "Sir, energy readings from the human vessels are off the scale." "I've never seen anything like this." Captain Chen's image remained steady on the screen. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying a note of terrible finality, "you should probably run." The transmission ended, leaving Kethvar staring at an empty screen. Around him, his bridge crew worked frantically at their stations as the human ships powered up systems that defied every law of physics the Empire understood. In the cold darkness of space, humanity had returned. And they were no longer the same species the Empire had tried to destroy. The stasis pod opened with a soft hiss, releasing gases that had kept Sarah Chen alive for over 9,000 years. She drew her first natural breath in millennia, her lungs burning as they adjusted to normal atmosphere. Around her, similar pods throughout the ship were opening, awakening the last defenders of Earth. Sarah pulled herself from the pod, her muscles weak from the long sleep but already beginning to remember their strength. The ship's medical systems had kept her body in perfect condition, while her mind had remained active, connected to the ship's vast neural network. She had experienced every moment of their long journey through the void, felt every star they passed, monitored every sensor reading as they waited for this day. "Welcome back, Captain," said a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Aria, the ship's artificial intelligence, had been her constant companion through the dark years. "All crew members are awakening successfully. Ship systems are operating at full capacity." Sarah moved through the corridors of the Retribution, one of humanity's last and greatest warships. The ship had been built in the final days before Earth's fall, incorporating every piece of technology humanity had developed in their desperate fight for survival. But that was only the beginning. During their long exile in the void between galaxies, they had improved, evolved, become something far beyond what they had been. The bridge was exactly as she had left it, but now it hummed with the energy of a fully awakened vessel. Her crew took their positions, men and women who had volunteered to sleep for 10,000 years for this moment. They had left Earth as refugees. They were returning as something else entirely. "Status report," Sarah ordered. "All systems operational," replied Commander Marcus Webb, her first officer. Like Sarah, he appeared young despite the millennia that had passed. "The other ships in the fleet are reporting ready status. We have 12 vessels operational, with 8 more still in deep hibernation. Sarah nodded. 20 ships total, all that remained of humanity's once mighty fleet. But these 20 ships represented the culmination of everything humanity had learned about war, survival, and the art of turning desperation into deadly innovation. Area, show me the Imperial fleet, Sarah commanded. The main view screen lit up with a tactical display, 60 Zelhari ships arranged in a standard Imperial formation. Massive vessels, each one larger than her own ships, bristling with weapons that could crack planets. In the old days before the Purge, such a fleet would have been unstoppable. Analysis, Sarah requested. Standard Imperial designs, Area reported. Technology approximately equivalent to what we faced 10,000 years ago, with minor improvements. No significant innovations detected. They appear to have become complacent. Sarah smiled grimly. The Empire had ruled for so long that they had forgotten how to truly innovate. They had perfected their existing technology but had stopped pushing the boundaries. Humanity, on the other hand, had spent 10,000 years in the darkness with nothing to do but think, plan, and evolve. "Sir," called out Lieutenant Torres from the weapons station, "Imperial flagship is hailing us again." "Let's hear what they have to say," Sarah said. Admiral Kethvar's image appeared on screen, his 4 eyes wide with what Sarah recognized as fear barely held in check. Good. Fear was appropriate. "Captain Chen," the Admiral began, his voice carrying the arrogance typical of the Zelhari, "I don't know what kind of technology you think you possess, but you are outnumbered 5 to 1. Surrender now and the Empire may be merciful." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, remembering everything the Empire had taken from humanity, not just the lives but the future. The children who would never be born, the art that would never be created, the dreams that had died with Earth. "Admiral," she said quietly, "you keep using that word mercy. Do you know what mercy looks like from our perspective?" She gestured and Arya displayed an image on the screen. Earth as it had been in its final moments. Cities burning, oceans boiling, 20 billion people dying in the space of a few hours. "This was your mercy," Sarah continued. "This was your final solution to the human problem." Kethvar's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping into his features. "Your species was a threat to galactic stability. The Empire had no choice." There's that phrase again. No choice. Sarah stood up from her command chair. "Admiral, do you want to know what we learned during our 10,000 years in exile?" She didn't wait for his answer. "We learned that choice is the only thing that truly matters. We chose to survive when you thought we were extinct. We chose to grow stronger instead of giving up. We chose to remember every single person you murdered." "Captain," Kethvar said, his voice now openly nervous, "whatever grievances you may have, they belong to the past. The Empire today is not the same as yours." "Stop." Sarah's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Arya, show the Admiral what we found." The screen changed to display intelligence gathered during their long journey. Images of Imperial worlds, countless species living under Zelhari rule. But also images of species that had been eliminated, worlds that had been cleansed, entire civilizations that had been judged too dangerous or too independent to survive. "You never stopped," Sarah said. "In the 10,000 years since you destroyed Earth, you've eliminated 47 other species, 47 entire civilizations wiped out because they didn't fit into your perfect galactic order." The bridge of Sarah's ship fell silent. Even her own crew, who had known this intellectually, felt the weight of those numbers. "The Empire maintains order," Kethvar said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The Empire maintains control," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference. Order suggests balance, fairness, justice. What you've created is a galaxy-wide prison where only the Zelhari are truly free." She moved closer to the screen, her eyes meeting his across the void. "But that ends today, Admiral. Because we came back. We survived your mercy, and we've spent 10,000 years preparing for this conversation." "You're threatening the Empire with 12 ships?" Kethvar asked, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Not threatening," Sarah replied. "Promising. You see, Admiral, we didn't just survive these past 10,000 years. We evolved. We learned. We became something new." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "We became your immune system." "What does that mean?" Kethvar demanded. Sarah smiled, and this time there was no warmth in it at all. It means, Admiral, that you're about to learn why the galaxy needed humanity to survive. Area. Power up the Nova Array. Around the Retribution, space itself began to bend and twist as weapon systems that violated the known laws of physics came online. The other human ships followed suit, their dark hulls beginning to glow with energies that made the void itself seem to whisper. On the Imperial flagship, every sensor screamed warnings as they detected energy readings that shouldn't exist. Weapons that used dark matter as ammunition, shields that folded space-time, engines that pulled power directly from stellar cores across impossible distances. Impossible, Kethvar breathed. 10,000 years, Admiral, Sarah said quietly. 10,000 years of having nothing to lose and everything to remember. You wanted to eliminate humanity because we were too dangerous to live alongside. You failed, and now you're going to learn what dangerous really means. The transmission ended, leaving the Imperial fleet alone with the awakening giants of humanity's revenge. Admiral Kethvar stared at the empty screen where Captain Chen's image had been, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. Around him, his bridge crew worked frantically at their stations, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. "Sir," his weapons officer called out. "The human ships, their energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases. I'm reading weapon systems that shouldn't be possible." "Explain," Kethvar demanded, forcing himself to focus on immediate concerns rather than the growing dread in his chest. "Sir, they appear to be manipulating dark matter, and their shields. They're not deflecting energy. They're redirecting it through folded space. I've never seen technology like this." Kethvar felt his confidence cracking. The Empire's weapons were the most advanced in the galaxy. Their ships were the products of 3,000 years of military engineering. How could these ancient human vessels possess technology that surpassed everything the Empire had achieved? "All ships, battle stations," he ordered, his voice carrying across the fleet communication system. "Prepare for combat." The Imperial fleet responded with the precision of centuries of training. 60 massive warships arranged themselves into the traditional Zelhari battle formation, their weapons charging and shields activating. It was a sight that had struck fear into countless species across the galaxy. But as Kethvar watched the human ships, he realized that fear was now pointing in the opposite direction. The 12 human vessels moved with an eerie synchronization that suggested they were operating as a single organism rather than separate ships. Their dark hulls pulsed with energy patterns that hurt to look at directly, and space around them seemed to ripple and bend in ways that defied physics. "Sir," his communications officer reported, "I'm detecting chatter between the human ships. But it's not using any form of communication we recognize. It's almost like they're sharing thoughts directly, shared consciousness." Kethvar had read about such things in ancient texts, theoretical studies of species that had evolved beyond individual awareness, but seeing it in action was terrifying in a way he hadn't expected. "Admiral," his sensor officer called out, her voice tight with stress. "One of the human ships is moving toward us. The vessel identifies as the Retribution." On the main screen, Kethvar watched as Captain Chen's ship approached his fleet. It moved without visible engines, seeming to glide through space as if the laws of motion didn't apply to it. As it drew closer, he could see details of its construction that made his skin crawl. The hull wasn't just dark. It seemed to absorb light completely, creating a void-black surface that hurt to perceive. Strange geometries covered its surface, angles that seemed to fold in on themselves and create optical illusions that made his eyes water. And along its length, weapon ports opened like breathing mouths, revealing glimpses of energies that pulsed like living things. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "the human ship has stopped exactly 1,000 kilometers from our formation. No closer, no farther. Precise, deliberate, confident." Everything about the human approach suggested they knew exactly what they were doing. While Kethvar felt increasingly out of his depth, "Hail them," he ordered. Captain Chen's image appeared on screen again, but now Kethvar could see her more clearly. She stood on a bridge that was unlike anything in Imperial design. Instead of hard edges and rigid surfaces, the human ship's interior seemed to flow like living tissue. Organic curves blended with technological systems in ways that suggested the boundary between machine and organism had been deliberately blurred. "Admiral," she said without preamble, "I'm going to give you one chance. Withdraw your fleet and return to Imperial space. Tell your superiors that humanity has returned and that the old agreements no longer apply. I cannot do that, Cathvar replied, though part of him wanted nothing more than to run. The Empire does not negotiate with terrorists. Captain Chen tilted her head slightly, and for a moment her expression was almost sad. Terrorists? Is that what you call us? We never targeted civilians, Admiral. We never eliminated entire species. We never burned worlds just to prove a point. Your species was. My species was guilty of being difficult to control. Chen interrupted. We asked questions you didn't want answered. We refused to accept your version of galactic order. We insisted on governing ourselves rather than submitting to imperial rule. She took a step closer to the screen, and Cathvar found himself leaning back involuntarily. But you're right about one thing, Admiral. We were dangerous. We are dangerous. We're dangerous because we refuse to accept that might makes right. We're dangerous because we believe that every species has the right to exist, even if they're inconvenient. We're dangerous because we remember. Captain, Cathvar said, trying to inject authority into his voice, whatever you think you can accomplish here, you're still outnumbered. 60 ships against 12. The mathematics are simple. Chen smiled, and Cathvar felt a chill run down his spine. Admiral, you're thinking like a Zellari. You see numbers and assume they tell the whole story. But humans learned a long time ago that numbers lie. She gestured, and the screen split to show tactical displays from both fleets. You see 60 ships against 12 and think you have an advantage. What you should be asking is, why are we so confident? As if in response to her words, the human ships began to change. Their hulls shifted and flowed, revealing weapon systems that Cathvar's sensors couldn't identify. Energy readings spiked beyond anything his instruments could measure, and space around the human fleet began to distort, creating ripples that spread outward like waves on a pond. Sir, his science officer called out. His voice barely controlled panic. They're manipulating space-time itself. I'm reading gravitational anomalies, temporal distortions. Admiral, I don't think these are just ships anymore. Cathvar looked at the readings flowing across his screens and felt his understanding of reality beginning to crack. Energy sources that drew power from stellar cores light years away. Weapons that existed partially outside normal space. Defensive systems that seemed to anticipate attacks before they were made. What are you? He whispered. Captain Chen heard him, and her expression softened slightly. We're what humanity became when you forced us to evolve or die. We're what happens when you take a species that refuses to surrender and give them 10,000 years to think about revenge. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of millennia. We're the consequence of your choices, Admiral. Every human life you took, every world you burned, every future you destroyed. It all led to this moment, sir, his weapons officer suddenly called out. The human ship. It's charging weapons. Energy readings are off the charts. On the screen, Captain Chen shook her head slowly. Not yet, Admiral. Not unless you force us to. Then what do you want? Cathvar demanded. Justice, Chen replied simply. For Earth. For the 47 species you've eliminated since then. For every civilization you've crushed because they didn't fit your definition of order. The Empire will never submit to human demands, Cathvar said, though his voice lacked conviction. We're not asking the Empire to submit, Chen said. We're telling you that your time as the sole arbiters of galactic law is over. Humanity has returned, and we're going to ensure that no species ever suffers what we suffered. She looked directly into his eyes, and Cathvar saw something there that terrified him more than any weapon. Not hatred, not anger, but an absolute, implacable certainty. Last chance, Admiral. Withdraw, or discover what 10,000 years of human innovation looks like when applied to the art of war. The transmission ended, leaving Cathvar alone with a choice that would determine not just the fate of his fleet, but the future of the galaxy itself. Around him, his officers waited for orders, their faces reflecting his own fear and uncertainty. 60 ships against 12. It should have been simple. But as Cathvar looked at the impossible readings coming from the human fleet, he began to understand that nothing about this encounter was going to be simple. The first shot came from the Imperial fleet. Admiral Cathvar had made his choice, and it was the same choice the Zellhari Empire had made 10,000 years before. Violence, dominance, the certainty that superior numbers would always triumph over superior purpose. Captain Sarah, Chen watched the massive energy beam streak toward her ship. The retribution, The weapon was powerful enough to crack a moon in half, a demonstration of the Empire's overwhelming technological advantage, or what they believed was their advantage. "Area," Sarah said calmly. "Demonstrate the void shield." "With pleasure, Captain." The Imperial beam struck what appeared to be empty space 300 meters from the Retribution's hull. Instead of continuing toward the human ship, the energy simply vanished, folded away into a pocket dimension that existed outside normal space-time. On the Imperial flagship, Kethvar watched his most powerful weapon disappear as if it had never existed. "Impossible," he breathed, but Sarah heard him through the open communication channel. "Not impossible," she replied, her image appearing on every screen in the Imperial fleet. "Inevitable." Area returned their energy with interest. The space around the Retribution rippled, and the Imperial beam reappeared, but now it was multiplied tenfold and redirected toward 3 Imperial vessels on the fleet's outer edge. The ship's shields flared and died under the assault, and their hulls began to crack and burn. "How?" Kethvar demanded, watching 3 of his most powerful warships reduced to drifting wreckage in seconds. 10,000 years of innovation," Sarah replied. 10,000 years of asking the questions your empire never bothered to consider. What happens when you refuse to accept the limitations others place on you? What becomes possible when survival is your only option? The other human ships began to move, spreading out in a formation that seemed chaotic until the Imperial computers began tracking their positions. They were creating a 3-dimensional web around the Imperial fleet, each ship positioned at precisely calculated points that created overlapping fields of some kind. "Sir," the Imperial science officer called out, "they're generating a containment field around our entire fleet. I've never seen anything like it. It's not energy-based, it's manipulating space itself." Kethvar felt the walls of reality closing in around him. "All ships open fire. Everything we have." The Imperial fleet unleashed its full power, 60 ships firing simultaneously, beams of coherent energy, matter disruptors, gravitational weapons, and plasma cannons all focused on the human vessels. It was enough firepower to sterilize a planet, concentrated into a space smaller than most cities. The human ships didn't even try to dodge. Instead, they simply absorbed every shot. Their hulls drank in the energy like living things feeding on starlight. And with each impact, the human ships grew brighter, more powerful, more terrifyingly alive. "They're converting our weapons fire into power for their own systems," the Imperial science officer reported, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Every shot we fire makes them stronger." Sarah's voice carried across all Imperial communication channels, calm and patient despite the chaos erupting around her. "This is what humanity learned in the darkness between galaxies, Admiral. How to take everything you throw at us and make it part of ourselves. How to turn your strengths into our weapons." One of the human ships, the Vengeance, moved toward a cluster of Imperial vessels. As it approached, space around it began to distort in ways that hurt to perceive. The ship seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, existing in multiple dimensions at once. "Sir," the Imperial tactical officer called out, "the human ship, it's not obeying the laws of physics. It's moving through space that shouldn't exist." The Vengeance reached the Imperial formation and did something that redefined Kethvar's understanding of warfare. It phased partially out of normal space-time, becoming a ghost ship that existed in the spaces between reality. Then it fired. The weapon wasn't energy or matter. It was something far more fundamental. It reached into the Imperial ships and simply convinced their atoms to stop holding together. 5 massive Imperial warships came apart at the molecular level, their crews dying before they even understood what was happening. "Impossible," Kethvar whispered. But he was beginning to understand that impossibility was humanity's specialty. "Not impossible," Sarah replied, and now there was something like pity in her voice. "Just beyond your current understanding. Your empire has ruled for so long that you've forgotten how to truly innovate. You've perfected the technology you understand, but you've stopped pushing into the unknown." Another human ship, the Retribution's sister vessel Redemption, demonstrated what pushing into the unknown looked like. It fired a weapon that created a miniature black hole, not to destroy the Imperial ships, but to trap them in a gravitational field that slowed time itself. The Imperial crews found themselves moving in slow motion, their thoughts sluggish, their reactions delayed, while the human ships moved around them with normal speed. "Time differential," Sarah explained conversationally. We learned to weaponize temporal distortion during our exile. Your crews are experiencing 1 second for every minute of real time. From their perspective, this battle will seem to last days. HFY watched his fleet being systematically dismantled by weapons that shouldn't exist, deployed by ships that moved in ways that violated every law of physics he understood. Half his vessels were already destroyed or disabled, and the humans hadn't even seemed to exert themselves. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We want you to understand," Sarah replied. "Understand what you did to us. Understand what you've been doing to other species for millennia. Understand that it ends now." The human ship called Remembrance moved toward the Imperial flagship, and as it approached, HFY could see details of its construction that made his mind reel. The hull wasn't built from metal and composites. It was grown like living tissue, but harder than any material in Imperial databases, and along its surface symbols pulsed with their own light, not just human writing but the scripts of dozens of other species. "Do you recognize those symbols, Admiral?" Sarah asked. HFY looked closer and felt his blood freeze. They were the written languages of the species the Empire had eliminated. Every civilization that had been judged too dangerous, too independent, too inconvenient to survive. "You remember them," he whispered. "We remember them all," Sarah confirmed. "Every species your Empire destroyed. Every culture you eliminated. Every voice you silenced. We carry them with us and we speak for them now." The Remembrance reached the Imperial flagship and extended something that wasn't quite a weapon. Instead, it projected a field that surrounded HFY's ship in a bubble of altered reality. Inside that bubble, the laws of physics were different. The laws of the Empire held no power. "This is your choice, Admiral," Sarah said, her image now appearing directly on HFY's bridge, as solid and real as if she were standing there. "You can continue to fight and watch your entire fleet be destroyed, or you can listen." HFY looked around his bridge, seeing the fear in his officers' faces, the hopelessness in their eyes. His fleet was being defeated by 12 ships using technology that redefined what warfare could be. "I'm listening," he said. "Good," Sarah replied, "because what happens next depends entirely on what you choose to do with what you learn here today." The battle paused, the human ships holding their positions around the shattered remnants of the Imperial fleet, but HFY could feel the potential for destruction hanging in the air like a held breath. The humans had demonstrated their power. Now came the test of whether that power would be used for justice or revenge. The Imperial flagship drifted in the strange bubble of altered reality, its weapons useless, its engines barely functional. Admiral HFY stood on his bridge, no longer the confident commander of an unstoppable fleet, but a broken being who had just witnessed the fundamental assumptions of his existence proven false. Captain Sarah Chen materialized on his bridge, not as a hologram but as a solid presence that defied every law of physics he understood. She stood calmly among his crew, her simple human appearance contrasting sharply with the impossible technology that had brought her there. "How?" HFY asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Dimensional folding," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "We learned to step between spaces during our exile. Your ship exists in normal space-time. I'm here through a fold that connects your bridge to mine across multiple dimensions." She looked around the Imperial bridge, taking in the elaborate displays and ceremonial decorations that spoke of the Empire's confidence in its own supremacy. Her expression was sad rather than triumphant. "You built all this on a foundation of murder," she said quietly. "Every symbol of your power, every demonstration of your authority, all of it paid for with the blood of species you deemed unworthy." "The Empire brought order to the galaxy," HFY said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "The Empire brought silence," Sarah corrected. "You eliminated every voice that questioned your authority, every perspective that challenged your worldview. You created order by murdering diversity." She moved to one of his tactical displays and with a gesture changed the information it showed. Instead of fleet positions and weapon readouts, it now displayed something that made HFY's crew step back in horror. Images of the Great Purge. Not the sanitized historical records the Empire kept, but the reality of what had happened. World after world burning, entire species dying in agony, children crying for parents who would never answer. "This is what your order looks like," Sarah said, her voice carrying 10,000 years of grief. "This is the foundation your civilization stands on." Those decisions were made by our ancestors, Kethvar protested. The current empire has continued the same policies, Sarah interrupted. 47 species eliminated since Earth burned. 47 civilizations that asked the wrong questions or refused to accept imperial rule. The display changed again, showing more recent atrocities, species that Kethvar recognized, worlds he had personally helped to pacify. The euphemisms the Empire used couldn't hide the reality of systematic genocide. You see, Sarah continued, that's what we learned during our exile. That evil doesn't require monsters. It just requires good people who convince themselves that necessary evils are still necessary. She turned to face him directly, and Kethvar saw something in her eyes that was worse than hatred, understanding. She didn't see him as a monster, but as a product of a system that had normalized the unthinkable. You're not evil, Admiral, she said softly. You're just wrong. Wrong about what order means. Wrong about what civilization requires. Wrong about who deserves to exist. Then what would you have us do? Kethvar asked. The galaxy needs structure. Without the Empire, there would be chaos. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't the cold expression of earlier. It was genuinely warm, touched with something that might have been hope. Admiral, let me show you what we built in the darkness. The bridge around them shimmered and changed. Suddenly, Kethvar found himself standing in a vast space that seemed to exist inside one of the human ships. But it wasn't just a ship's interior. It was a world. Impossible gardens stretched into the distance, filled with plants from 1,000 different planets. Cities rose and fell in gentle curves that followed organic principles rather than rigid engineering. And everywhere, beings moved and worked and lived together in harmony. This is the Ark-World Sanctuary, Sarah explained. One of 20 we built during our exile. Each one carries the genetic and cultural legacy of species the Empire destroyed. Kethvar stared in amazement at creatures he recognized. Species that had supposedly been extinct for millennia. Their civilizations preserved and allowed to grow in ways the Empire had never permitted. How? He asked. We saved who we could, Sarah replied. During the Purge, human ships rescued survivors, refugees, anyone who could be brought to safety. We carried them with us into exile and gave them space to rebuild. They walked through streets where beings from dozens of different species worked together on projects that Kethvar couldn't begin to understand. Art that combined visual, auditory, and psychic elements. Science that treated consciousness as a fundamental force of nature. Technology that grew rather than being built. This is what civilization looks like when it's not based on dominance, Sarah said, when every species is allowed to contribute their unique perspective to the whole. But the conflicts, Kethvar protested. The wars between species. The Empire ended all that. The Empire prevented growth, Sarah corrected. Yes, there were conflicts. That's what happens when different perspectives meet. But conflict isn't evil, Admiral. Conflict is how new ideas are born. The Empire eliminated conflict by eliminating everyone who might disagree. They stopped at a memorial wall covered with names in hundreds of different scripts, the beings who had died during the Great Purge and the systematic eliminations that followed. We remember them all, Sarah said. Not just humans, but every species your Empire destroyed. We carry their memories, their dreams, their potential, and we've spent 10,000 years learning from their unique perspectives. Is this why you've returned? Kethvar asked. For revenge? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hand resting on the memorial wall. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of millennia. We came back because the galaxy needs an immune system, she said. Something to prevent what happened to us from happening to others. The Empire has grown too powerful, too confident in its own righteousness. Someone needs to say no when you decide another species is too inconvenient to live. And you think 12 ships can stand against the entire Empire? Sarah turned to look at him, and Kethvar saw something in her expression that made him step back. Not anger or hatred, but an absolute certainty that was more terrifying than any weapon. Admiral, she said quietly, these aren't the only 12 ships. They're just the first 12. We've been building for 10,000 years, creating not just weapons, but an entire civilization dedicated to preventing genocide. Right now, human fleets are moving through imperial space, taking positions around every world where systematic elimination is planned. The memorial wall shimmered and became a tactical display showing the entire galaxy. Red dots marked imperial worlds. Blue dots showed human positions. There were hundreds of blue dots, maybe thousands, all moving with the precision of a carefully orchestrated plan. We know everything, Sarah continued. Every Imperial plan, every scheduled pacification, every species marked for elimination. We've been watching and preparing for this day since the moment Earth burned. Kethvar felt his legs give way, and he sank to his knees before the display. The scale of what she was showing him was beyond comprehension. Not just a military operation, but a complete shadow civilization that had been growing in the darkness, preparing to challenge the Empire's absolute power. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "We want you to choose," Sarah replied. "Go back to your superiors. Tell them that humanity has returned and that the old rules no longer apply. Tell them that the systematic elimination of species ends now. They'll never accept that. The Empire doesn't negotiate." "Then the Empire will fall," Sarah said simply. "Not through conquest, Admiral. Through evolution. We're going to show the galaxy what civilization looks like when it's based on cooperation rather than domination. And eventually, even the Zelhari will have to choose between growing or dying." The vision faded, and Kethvar found himself back on his own bridge, staring at Captain Chen's calm expression. Around him, his crew watched with the hollow eyes of beings who had seen their entire worldview collapse. "Your fleet is free to go," Sarah said. "Carry our message to your empire. Tell them that the galaxy's immune system has awakened and the age of unchallenged genocide is over." "And if we refuse?" Kethvar asked. Sarah's expression didn't change, but the space around the Imperial flagship filled with the shadowy outlines of more human vessels. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all invisible until this moment. "Then you'll discover what 10,000 years of human innovation looks like when applied to the complete restructuring of galactic civilization," she said. "But that's not what we want, Admiral. We want partners, not subjects. We want a galaxy where every species has the right to exist, even if they're inconvenient." The transmission ended, leaving Kethvar alone with the wreckage of his fleet and a choice that would determine the future of the galaxy. Around him, space filled with the blue glow of human ships as they prepared to depart for their next destination. They had delivered their message. Now it was up to the Empire to decide what kind of galaxy they wanted to live in. As Kethvar watched the human fleet disappear into the darkness between stars, he realized that everything had changed. The Empire's age of absolute power was over. The age of human justice had begun.